Hello, team players. It's time for another teamwork build. I know a lot of people like the playstyle of doing as much damage as possible. And I'm here to tell you, you absolutely can build that towards teamwork. You just have to have a reason to do damage other than just to do damage. For the Elemental Decay Witch, we do want to do as much damage as possible. And there's definitely a reason for it other than just to do damage. But we'll talk about that when we get to the Witch Patron of this build. But if you're one of those players that likes to do a whole bunch of damage, this could be the build for you. So to start with, let's talk about ability scores. Your most important ability score for this build is going to be Intelligence. After all, we are an intelligence-based caster, and we do want our spell attack and DC to be as high as possible. But there's another reason too. Recall knowledge is going to be pretty important for this build, which means we need to have high intelligence for those skills. Our second most important stat is going to be dexterity. We need high dexterity since we can't wear armor. We do want to be out of melee combat with this build for sure, but that doesn't mean we're not going to get hits. And we definitely do not want to get crit in this build. So, high AC is going to be vital. And our last most important is going to be wisdom, because again, recall knowledge is going to be pretty important for this build. Which means we need to have high wisdom for things like nature and religion. For skills, I do recommend you put most of your points into recall knowledge skills. That's arcana, occultism, society, nature, and religion. At least those are the main ones anyway. The main thing we want to find out from recall knowledge is not so much what our enemies are weak to, because we have abilities that will make enemies weak to different types of damage, but we want to know what our enemies are immune to and what their lowest defense is. We definitely don't want to hit the enemies with a spell that they're immune to, and knowing their lowest saving throw or if their AC is the lowest will tell us what spell to use. But not only that, but it'll tell our allies what to use against them as well. So yeah, recall knowledge is super important here. We want to be using that on our third action a lot. For our patron, we're going to be going with Devourer of Decay. The main reason for this is our familiar ability. If we cast or sustain a hex, then an enemy that is within 15 feet of our familiar that has less than half its hit points becomes sickened 1 unless they succeed on a fortitude save against our spell DC. This is the main reason why we want to do a bunch of damage in this build. So we can use this familiar ability on them. Because, again, we can only use it if they're below half their hit points. We also get the Scoundrelly Hex cantrip, allowing us to frighten foes when we can't use our familiar ability against them. Plus, this allows us to debuff 2 foes if one is below half health. And of course, this will give us the primal list, a great spell list for this build, as it does have a bunch of elemental spells we can use to damage foes to get them below half their hit points. So we'll pick up our first class feat at level 2, and we're going to go with basic lesson for Lesson of the Elements. This will give us the Elemental Betrayal Hex. Basically, we get to choose any element except vitality or void damage and give an opponent weakness to that type of damage. Which basically means we're going to do more damage with our spells. And anyone else who can do that type of damage will also do more. Doesn't work on physical damage. However, there are runes that give marshals the ability to do elemental damage on a hit with their weapons. So even marshals can take advantage of this. And we can sustain it for up to 1 minute. This is just going to help us with our damage. This and the next feat we're going to take are why we really don't need to know what they're weak to. For our level 4 feat, we're going to be taking Portent of Haruspex, a brand new one from Howl the Wild, and it is insanely good for this build. As a reaction, if a creature within 30 feet of us is reduced to 0 hit points in a way that doesn't destroy their body, we can roll a d12. We compare that to the table that I have on screen. Whatever we roll, the next time us or our allies do that type of damage to the enemy before the end of our next turn, that enemy has a weakness equal to our level to that type of damage. This feat is why it's beneficial for us to have many different types of damage in this belt, and why it's beneficial to have an occult caster in your party, as the only type of damage on this list that we really can't do is mental. And that's the occult list's bread and butter. But we're not always going to be able to prepare all the damage types on this list. So a marshal would help this build as well. Not only to protect us, but to do the physical types of damage, which are more common rolls on this table. The other thing is that once we get a foe down to 0 hit points, we'll want to use our familiar ability on it, or at least try to, and then most likely either debuff the opponent with some of our focus spells we're going to take later, or move on to a different enemy and try to get them down to 0 hit points. But eventually a foe is going to go down to 0 hit points. Heck, maybe even one of our allies might go down to 0 hit points. So if that's the case, then we can start off a new enemy by immediately doing a bunch of damage to them, which makes it easier for us to use our familiar ability. For our level 6 feat, we're going to take Greater Lesson, and we're going to go with the Lesson of Decay. This will give us the Mycological Malady Hex, allowing us to debuff even things like skeletons and zombies, or other undead as long as they aren't incorporeal. Because these undead are immune to mental effects, this means our Scrounger's Glee Hex will not work on them. But this will at least make us able to enfeeble them, lowering their damage output. And if they get high enough in the disease, they're even slowed 1, which won't really work on zombies since they're already slowed. But hey, against other creatures, slowed 1 is amazing. At level 8, it's Stitched Familiar, so we can do a good amount of slashing damage with a basic reflex save. This works pretty well if we roll slashing on our Portent of Haruspex. But not only that, if they fail their save, they're also immobilized for 1 round or until it escapes against your spell DC, which effectively means they're wasting at least 1 action, and otherwise they have to use ranged attacks since they, can't use move actions. We do have to command our familiar to do this, but it does target an enemy within 30 feet, which means this is honestly pretty good. And this is just another way that we can do damage to get them below half their hit points. At level 10, it's Major Lesson for Lesson of Death. That'll give us the Curse of Death Hex and the Raise Dead spell. Raise Dead is important, but Curse of Death is just pretty awesome. This allows us to do void damage and fatigue a target. And fatigued is honestly a pretty rare condition. And it's a -1 on AC and all their saving throws, which is pretty nice. Again, this is just another way we can debuff the opponent, make it more susceptible to our spells, and of course, anything else anybody else wants to do. Again, we are trying to get our opponent down to half its hit points so we can use our familiar ability on them. This is a status penalty, so it won't stack with other stuff, but hey, we need to have multiple ways of debuffing opponents, particularly ones that target different saving throws. After that, we're going to need Hex Focus so we can get all of our focus points back whenever we refocus, and we don't have to worry as much about our focus points, because we do have quite a few hexes in this belt, and some of them are going to require focus points. And Quickened Casting is pretty much a no-brainer here, because we might need to cast a spell, sustain a hex, and move all in the same turn. So yeah, just straight up cast a spell for one action. Pretty amazing. It is only a once per day thing, so we're not going to be able to do this too often, but it is good to have that option available. Next up is Siphon Power, which lets us cast one of our spells our familiar knows we gained from our patron or one of our lessons without a spell slot. We're mostly going to want to use this one for whatever spell we picked up from Lesson of the Elements. As again, we're trying to do as much damage as possible here. But we can still use it for our Enfeeble spell we got from our patron or our Raise Dead spell we got from Lesson of Death. We don't really want to use this for insect form because we don't want to go into insect form. I mean, I know that's kind of a waste of a feat if we're not even going to use the spell we gain from it, but we don't want to use that unless we absolutely have to. That's kind of a last resort type thing. But other than that, just whatever spell works for the given situation, assuming it's a spell we gained from our patron or our lessons. Next, we'll want to take Patron's Claim. Effectively, this lets us do a good amount of spirit damage with a basic Fortitude save. And if they fail, they're drained, dealing even more damage. Thus, this is a fantastic way of getting an enemy below half its hit points, which again lets us use our familiar ability. And finally, for level 20, it's Split Hex. This effectively means we can spend an action to reduce a hex's rank by 2, but have it affect 2 targets. This is really good with our Elemental Betrayal Hex and our spells that hit a bunch of targets. Things like Fireball, for instance. This effectively means we can give 2 enemies weakness to our area spells. And we can also use it on our other hexes too to debuff 2 foes. Granted, it won't be as high of a debuff, but we can use this feat on any of our hexes. For spells, I recommend you pick as many elemental spells as you can, particularly different types, and especially elemental spells that deal damage and do something else. For instance, things like Frostbite and Acid Grip are great for this build. But you're also going to want area spells like Fireball. So, pick what you want, but those are my recommendations for this build. I also recommend you pick up a few difficult terrain spells like Mud Pit. You're not going to need debuff spells because your hexes are going to take care of that. Bottom line here, for this build, you want to do as much damage as possible, but it's also good to have spells that do something else or hit multiple targets. A lot of people do use the free archetype variant rule, so I do want to talk about a little bit about some archetypes you could take with this build. Now, I haven't really talked about recall knowledge too much of this in this build, but it is important. So, if you've got free archetypes, you might consider taking the Lore Master dedication. This would effectively allow you to have Lore Master lore, which would give you a skill that goes off intelligence that you could use to recall knowledge about any subject. It does only go up to experts, and you can only get that if you get to legendary in a skill you can use for Decipher Writing, which for this build would probably be Nature. But it is still good to have a recall knowledge skill you can use on anything. It's got feats like Assured Knowledge, which is basically assurance on all recall knowledge checks, which is pretty darn amazing. But you could also go with the Eldritch Researcher here. That'll give you an extra cantrip, and it has feats like True Hypercognition, which is a bunch of recall knowledge skills at once, and Seeker of Truth, which could give you the Knowledge Cleric domain, which would let you have advantage on a recall knowledge check for a focus point. But honestly, that's just another focus point down the drain, so you may not go that route. The last one I recommend for this build is Rogue. Skill Mastery would be huge for this build, as you're not going to be able to be legendary in all recall knowledge skills, but with Skill Mastery, you could at least become expert in the ones you're not legendary in. which is kind of a big deal for this build. For items, honestly, there's not a whole lot that would help this build other than basic stuff. But scrolls and wands will help this build some. There may be a point where you run out of spell slots. If that's the case, it'll be good to have a wand or scroll of a spell that you might not have been able to prepare. Or just any spell that your familiar knows. It's also going to be good for the few spells on the primal list that require will saves. You're not going to want to waste your spells that your familiar knows on those, because you do want to focus on damage in this build. But sometimes you're going to run into enemies that have extremely low will saves. If that's the case, then once you do get them down to half hit points and can use your familiar ability on them, it may be prudent to target their will saves. This is especially true if you do not have an occult caster in the party. Otherwise, you're going to want to focus on damaging spells and difficult terrain. Now it's time for my Ancestry recommendations. The first Ancestry I recommend for this build is Elf. You can do a lot with Elf with this build. If you don't have free Archetype, or you choose not to go Rogue with your free Archetype, then Ancestral Longevity and that line of feats is going to help a lot. We need to be as good at the recall knowledge skills as we can be, and this will help with that. If you don't take skill mastery from Rogue, or you simply don't have free Archetype. Elf can also give you a free cantrip if you don't go Eldritch Researcher. And the final reason to go Elf is that speed, as a 30-foot move speed is really good on spellcasters, a lot of spellcasters. Sure, there's War Priest, Clerics, and Druids who can wear armor, but just about every other spellcaster will appreciate that speed increase, including this belt. Plus, you can take feats like Elf Step and Nimble Elf to help your movement even more. Elf is definitely one that I highly recommend for this belt. For heritage, really doesn't matter. You can go with any elf heritage you want here. I personally would go with Cavern Elf because having Dark Vision is pretty amazing. But again, you can pick what you want. The other Ancestry I recommend for this build is the Knoll, or whatever it's called now. I don't remember what they said the new name for the Knoll was. Knoll is very flavorful for this build, and it has a few feats that will definitely help you out. You won't have many reactions in this build, so Pack Hunter is a pretty awesome feat here. And you're going to have high dex, so Pack Stalker will help out as well, especially if your allies are trying to stealth and aren't very good at it. And if you've got at least decent charisma, then Laughing Knoll is a great feat here, as intimidation is always a good thing to do. And remember, if you frighten a foe at the beginning of combat, which Laughing Knoll lets you do, then you can use Scrounger's Glee to frighten a second foe. For heritage, if you go Knoll, the only one I don't recommend is the Great Knoll, as you will never use athletics in this build. Absolutely not. Witch Knoll is probably the most flavorful for this build, but you really don't need it. This build is really good for two types of players. The first is new players, especially if they're coming from a system like D&D 5e. And the second is players who seem to focus on doing as much damage as possible. As with this build, you can definitely still do massive damage, but in order to unlock the true potential of this build, you need to use Recall Knowledge and the other stuff that this build can do. You are going to do more damage if you use those options, and as a side effect, you're also going to be helping your team, which is pretty awesome. So, this is an excellent build to teach those types of players that teamwork is important in this system. But that's it for me, guys. So, if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and leave a like, and let me know what you think of this new format. in the comments below. And if you want a Google Sheet for this and a bunch of my other builds, or you want my videos early and without ads, you can become a member of my Patreon page. Or if you just want my videos early and are okay with ads, you can become a member of this channel. You can also join my Discord server if you want to talk teamwork or anything else with me and other people. And remember, teamwork is vital. It helps us solve problems.